Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila from Forbes Books, and I'm joined by my friend Katie Goar, president of Quadel, author of the new book, Audacity. Katie, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me here.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I kind of want to start with the why question. Like, why now at this point in your career to tell your story? Because it's not that you were never not public facing person. You always were, obviously having leadership roles, but you've done the TED Talk recently. You have this book coming out. Why did you feel comfortable now to share your story?
Great question. Why not share it?
Right.
First off, I think that, there has always been the people that say, oh, you should write a book. Oh, you should do this. And you're like, okay, well, there's never a good time to do that. But I actually started diving through some of my origin story. And as I started to talk about it, because for years, I didn't tell anybody. Like I was not going to go there, so to speak. But as I started to talk about it and interact with people, I was actually surprised how many people were coming up to me and then talking about their story. And I realized that there's a lot of synergy there as we start to confront some of our origin stories, our housing insecurity, food insecurity, really whatever those may be, that I thought there's real power here for many of us to be able to say, this is actually why I'm in the field I am, why I want to do more, why I want to actually try to make an impact. Because so many of us think, you have to be like an influencer
Right.
to have influence. I actually think it comes to something a little more common and human to human, that if we just openly start talking about some of these things, that we'll have more synergy together and we actually may be able to go a little further faster. And so I do talk about housing a lot, but I think it has applicability to a lot of areas of life.
Yeah, and obviously you've become one of America's strongest voices in housing for the last 5+ years. You've hosted a podcast, and you can almost see the delineation of like, you were kind of like doing this podcast where you're like, oh, okay, I'm an expert and I'm gonna talk to other experts. But then something changed about like halfway through. You're like, I should probably start like telling more about my story. And that sort of led you into the TED Talk, which if you haven't watched, we'll link that so you can check it out. But like, was there a moment of you were like that almost like you felt comfortable? Because you mentioned like you didn't want to go there for my time. Was there a moment in that drove you to be like, maybe I should just start bringing this up? Because your podcast was always like question answer, but like, it became more personal. Was there something that sort of initiated that, or it became organic just because as you kept seeing the idea of like sharing your story and how important it would be for other people?
I'm not sure if there was a real, like, I'm going to do, must do. There wasn't like a vision board mantra moment
Right.
that I had, but I just realized that as people started to get to know that part of my early life and that housing insecurity, that it started to change the attachment to what we were doing, not just my staff, but myself, how we're making impact, and then how we're connecting with other people, because there's also this perception of who needs housing. And so when I started talking about how important housing was, or what I went through with being homeless, not to do a plot twist here and like spell it or
Right.
anything, but as I started talking about it, it helped demystify who needs housing. And I think that was the real moment where I was like, okay, you need to lean in a little bit more on this, because it's actually very helpful when you think about housing policy and just meeting basic needs for people who need affordable housing.
Yeah. And one of the reasons you do it too is, and it's a kind of through line a lot of your podcast, is breaking stereotypes. And you talk about just there about like, hey, listen, it's not so cookie cutter of what a homeless person is. It's not a demographic or a culture or what have you. It could be literally anyone. Tell me about some of these stereotypes that are still as woke as we all we hope to be. Like, tell me this idea about why these stereotypes still persist.
It's a very complex problem that people struggle to help solve. It's because we want to not understand the person. We want to say, well, you must be in a condition because you were lazy and didn't get a job.
Right.
Well, you must be struggling because you didn't go to school. And we start attaching these abstract labels to try to figure out, you must deserve that condition because you were not fill in the blank. And I think that's probably the obstacle. There's a lot of details to this, but that's an obstacle to say, well, wait, hold at the core, there's still a person. And at the core, they may or may not have made decisions. They could be employed but underemployed. They could have had a rent increase but now have to sleep in the car. They could have a lot of medical bills. I mean, like, there's all of these when you really start picking apart the whys and how it happened. But ultimately, it is not necessarily always a choice that they've said, I'm going to go and do that. It's through like a series of circumstances. And I would then counter and say, if you actually remember that this is a point in time for a person, that identity is not fixed. And that for me, all of a sudden was like, hold on, I was homeless, but now I'm a housing CEO. So I actually am proof of concept that that point in time can change, and that was just a conditional moment. And I think that's a piece that we're missing about, like, yeah, what are you going to do? Person's homeless. Like, no. Actually, there's so much more a person can give, and we can't give up on them.
And one of the things that you push back on in the book, and a word that was very popular during the pandemic, was bootstrapping. And you kind of push back on bootstrapping because the devil's advocate to your argument would be like, well, why don't these people just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get out of homelessness?
Yep.
That if you work hard enough, you won't be homeless anymore.
Right.
Tell me about this idea about pushing back against bootstrap, because like I said, during the pandemic, everyone's like, here's how we're going to get through this horrific thing. We're going to bootstrap it. And it's, in theory, sure, but in practice, it's obviously impossible. Yeah. Tell me about why you push back so hard on bootstrapping.
A kid cannot get out of homelessness, no matter how much bootstrapping. And there are over 1 million kids or more, depending on what statistic you're reading, of kids who are in homelessness. So there's no amount of bootstrapping that's going to improve their condition. A single mom, it only has so many hours in the day. She can't go out and get a 4th or 5th or 6th job. It just doesn't work like that. So bootstrapping is not going to be able to be the only tool by which she can make an improvement. And I speak to that, obviously raised by a single mom who had 4 kids, and she was working the 3 jobs. She was doing everything, and we still couldn't make it. And it's not just those two, it's teachers, it's EMTs. So there's pieces that bootstrap can only get you so far.
Right.
And then something else has to be able to step in here. And, there's times when bootstrapping works.
Sure.
When I was,
and part of it was your mother. Your mother was bootstrapping.
She was, correct.
Yeah.
And, when I was in college, I was like, you've got to sort this out and get your stuff together, because I felt that was the only thing that was going to keep me from actually going back and living like the life that I had come out of. So I was like, you better get your act together. And when everybody else was, doing all the other fun things, I was actually working, and I was like saying, you have to graduate because this is your only way out. So for a little bit, bootstrap works, but it can only do so much.
Yeah. And speaking of your earlier life, you opened the book, The Audacity, talking about your younger brother, I believe, who was asked to draw a picture of a house.
Yep.
And he drew a tent.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that moment obviously encapsulates what we've been talking about. Well, why was that moment so important to open the book up?
He actually thought that was our house. He had started kindergarten, and when the teacher said to everybody, first week, first day, whatever it was, draw a picture of your house, he literally thought that was our house. And when he came back to the tent to tell me about it, a couple of things happened. One, I was sad for him because he didn't know better.
Right.
And then 2, immediately got really, really afraid that we were going to get reported. And so there was this dualism here of like, my heart was breaking, but yet I was also starting to panic a little because I was the oldest of the 4 kids. So I had assumed the role of trying to watch everybody, protect everybody while my mom was working. And at that moment, I was like, there's no way. Like, how are we all going to stay together? What's going to happen? And I started doing all this mental contingency mapping. But it just really was hard to hear. I knew we were in the tent. It wasn't like it was a shop.
Right.
But it was hard to hear it through his eyes.
Wow. It's so funny because you talk about being like this teenage girl going through this, and obviously being self-aware enough that not only was that idea of your brother drawing this tent, sad, but also oh, damn, like if somebody sees us, we could be in trouble. Most people wouldn't even go there, but you were obviously self-aware. And I think many of us can admit that we were all jerks as kids. Did you ever, I mean, did you have, what was your jerk phase like? Did you ever have a time when you were like with your mom and you've got all these younger siblings and you're like, Mom, why are we like this? Like, did you ever ask your question like plainly as a kid does without realizing that there's nuance to things? But like, you say, Mom, why are we living in this tent? What did you do wrong that brought us here? Did that ever come up? Did you have that jerk phase as a teenager?
I think the jerk phase looked a little different. It came through as bitterness and resentfulness. Like I was just really, really angry because we had been in a house and then lost it. So as opposed to my younger two brothers, my brother and my sister, that's what they knew.
Right.
And so, my youngest sister was one. So like I had stability and then we lost it. So I was so angry about that. And that was my jerk phase, if you will.
Yeah.
It was like, I was so mad about that. And then at the same time, I kept thinking, oh, they're going to fix the marriage. Oh, I had like this unrelenting hopefulness that, oh, he's going to come back. It's not abandonment. It's all going to get fixed. They're going to work it out. And so like there was this denial moment. And maybe a little bit of that was like to try to keep some optimism, to be like, maybe it will get better. But then as every day went along, obviously it didn't. So yeah, my jerk phase was a little more, like I wasn't throwing tantrums. I was actually like having to cook for my siblings and actually have to watch them. So responsibility kept me out of some of that piece.
Right.
But there were other pieces that settled in. But on the upside here, dealing with conflict comes naturally, because once you've lived through something like that, you're like, is this really a major issue? Or how I make decisions related to risk? I actually have a much better filter because of some of this.
We talked about the stereotypes earlier, and in the word blame gets thrown around, like they're the reason these folks are in this because of drug use or broken marriages. What have you. Did you have to fight that with your mom of like assigning blame to her that she was the reason that she did that? Was there any kind of resentment in terms of like, Mom, you're the reason this is like this? Maybe something happened with Dad. Because I think that's the problem with a lot of times trying to fix something. You're spending so much time blaming someone for the problem as opposed to just trying to fix it. Did Dad ever creep in?
We were in survival mode, wondering where the meals were coming. And we were trying to sort out exactly what the next steps were going to be. And so there was a lot of focus on just making it through. But it wasn't until later when I got older that I was like, okay, that could have been done differently. And there were several periods where I was like, that did not need to happen like that. But then when I became a mom myself, I realized I was like, maybe it wasn't so cut and dry.
Yeah.
And so I did have my moment where I came around a little differently and thought, you are going to do everything you can and try to do the best you can as a parent. And honestly, we're trying to figure it out as a parent.
Sure.
So like there's a lot of sores and there's a lot of flops when it comes to that.
Yeah. And in the book, you talk about the necklace of shame. Tell me about that in relation to what we've been talking about.
So it's ironic because when we were in that tent, my siblings and I all said we were not going to talk about this. We were not going to let other people know. And a lot of that was from safety. This was in a different time where the tracking mechanisms, the reporting mechanisms were not as robust as they are here today. Right. But you still knew that if that information got circulated, it could potentially break us all apart. Right. And so even in being a kid, we knew that. And so my sister and I, the oldest two, we had the bigs and the littles. We just basically were like, we're not talking about this. We're not letting anybody know. We're going to pretend like it's all okay. And a lot of people do that for survival and learning. But we also hadn't talked about it even when we got older. Like when we're in our 30s, our 40s, we still all never talked about it. And it wasn't until I started preparing for the talk that we all started to openly talk about this moment again. And one of the things that necklace of shame was, we realized we had self-absorbed that early, and we wore it and we continued to wear it until we're adults. Like,
Wow.
you could talk about it now. Like, everybody
Wow.
talks about everything,
Yeah.
but that stayed with us. And the longer we wore it, we were giving that shame more power than it was needed.
Those hidden traumas that when people don't talk about things, it do you think it was a survival mechanism, or do you think it made it worse? Whereas if you think you could have, not to say like be proud of what you went through, but also like the fact that you could openly talk about it. Did that sort of bury that trauma that it lingered longer than it probably should have?
It actually exposed some things, meaning the more you realize that that was not normal, then you're like, okay, maybe this is why I freak out if my gas tank is low.
Right. Yes.
Because maybe it is not just that the gas tank is low, but you ran out of gas because you didn't have money and you were on the side of the road when you were younger. And you're like, oh, maybe this all is linked
Yeah.
together. And you start seeing imprints where it has gone and moved its fingerprints onto you later in life. And so as we were talking about this, you're like, I'm not sure that response is quite normal. And it's probably related to the instability and insecurity early
Yeah.
on in life. And that's what makes housing so important, is because when you have the instability of housing, it's not just that house. It's showing up in health, it's showing up in education, it's showing up in employment,
Yeah.
health, mental health, like all of the things later. And so that's why, as a proponent of affordable housing, I'm saying, like, this is much more than just where do you live. This is how you function and how you contribute later in life.
It's almost as if that trauma like hardwired you. It's sort of like evolution, right? Like we're hardwired for things that are from, being afraid of tigers eating us, and now we've just sort of translated that to now. I remember I was speaking to a scientist once, and I said, why do people hate when others talk behind their back?
Yeah.
And they're like, we're hardwired for that, because in ancient times, if people talked about your back, that meant that you might get booted from the tribe, and if you get booted from the tribe, you're probably going to die. So all of this hardwires you. Do you think that, did you have to break some of that hardwiring, or is it just like it's just there and you just have to be, like you said, you have to be aware of this new wiring that you have that maybe others might not have?
Mm-hmm. So as I started preparing for the TED Talk and writing the book and even doing the podcast, I started realizing, okay, what's working? And like, what is your, everybody talks about a superpower. And I
Yeah.
do think that everybody has a superpower.
Sure.
But you're like, this is what was great about this experience, because this is how I learned life from the rough side of the tracks,
Right.
right? But then you're like, maybe I also, here's a list that I need to work on and do a little better about. And it helped me go through some of that.
That's great. In the book, you make the clear distinction between condition and identity. I think to most people, they're kind of intertwined, but tell me about the differences between condition and identity.
So homelessness is a condition. It's a point in time. It's not an identity. And so that was the distinction that I really wanted to convey. And I think that also can apply to a lot of other hardships in life too. It could say, this was a condition. This was a moment in time. This was something that happened. And you get to choose from that backpack of life what you want to say, part of my identity that worked, part of my identity maybe I need to work on. And then I actually bring forward in the book and I say, there's actually a point where now you can use that for other people or for other messages, because we didn't go through all of this to just like pack it away and keep it in the backpack, right? You actually have that now as a tool for you to move forward and choose to say, maybe I should talk about this openly. Maybe I should help other people. And I give several examples in the book of people who have done that in life.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing all that. And so let's move to how you kind of transitioned into a leadership role. And in the book, you talk about audacious problem solvers, and that true leadership belongs to the audacious problem solvers. What does that mean? What is an audacious problem solver to you?
So many times we're taught to raise our hand in class when we have a question. right? I mean, that's the institutional, systematic way
Sure.
that we have order and we have compliance. But I've realized through my decades of leadership, if you will, and life experience that there's times when waiting to be called on, waiting to raise your hand just isn't going to cut it. And so you have to have some periods and some tools in your life where you say, I'm going to actually need to get up and go do something about this. I'm going to need to have a different skill set because waiting to be called on isn't happening. Or raising my hand, maybe I don't feel ready to raise my hand and ask the question. And so I actually go through and I unpack specific ways to be able to say, being audacious can manifest itself in multiple ways in your life. And knowing when you need a nudge to do that. And I actually break apart some patterns and frameworks by which you can make that happen.
That's great. So let's tie that into your sort of leadership journey, because we kind of jumped the gun a little bit by saying you lived in a tent and now you're running Quadel. So there's a lot going on there, a lot of water under that bridge. So tell me about that leadership journey. Like you mentioned the fact that, and you're right about, like, it was a struggle going through school because all the other things you had to do to prevent yourself from going back to the tent, but also you had this drive to become successful. So tell us how a girl living in a tent becomes one of the biggest voices in affordable housing in the United States.
I mean, there's the glitchy cliche that's like, oh, from homeless to housing CEO.
Right.
Okay, but it wasn't as tidy as that.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
It was very, very messy. And it also wasn't strategic. Like, I didn't go out and say, I'm going to fix affordable housing. So that's actually kind of unique because it was a progression. What was ultimately driving me was I said, I'm never going to live like that again. So then I'm going to go to college. Okay, when I get out of college, I'm like, I have to get a job because I am not going to have a chance where I'm like, how are we going to eat today? And so that was the moment. And I distinctly remember this because I had run away from home, which happened, maybe that was part of my jerk phase.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm sick of this. And, you're like, you're 13. Exactly where are you going?
Right.
And the world was a little different back then too.
Yes.
But so I don't advocate that as a coping mechanism, clearly, because that's actually like a whole nother problem. But I would run away and I would sit and think, you cannot live like this any longer. And, at that time I was about 12 or 13-ish. And the fact that my mind was saying, you cannot live like this any longer, it just kept forcing me to get to the next phase. And then it would force me to get to the next one. And that sort of was the driver to get out of that. But that progression, even when I got out of college and, continuing my degrees and stuff, I said, you have to get a job. And so it was like, it doesn't matter what job, just get a job. And so there was always like the next moment. And then once you got the job, it was like, okay, you have to do this. And it just kept going. But eventually I had a family and it was like, okay, you have to have health insurance. And there was always that push to say, what can you do to create that moment of stability and survival that you didn't have necessarily? And so I was trying to replace that. And the journey just progressed. And I don't know if there was a heart moment that the mission aligned. I'm not going to, it definitely was not planned.
Right.
And then eventually I started working in affordable housing and at a housing agency. And I realized at that point that I identified with what was needed and I identified with the people who needed it.
Wow. And so during that journey, did you realize that you were making, it's something Pardavila, the famous coach, calls the innocent climb. Did you realize the steps you were taking were leading you to become a quote unquote leader in the industry? Were you aware of that? The fact that these little baby steps and working through agencies and working through different companies, that was taking you down that path? Tell me about like your mindset during all of that.
I was not master planned and I had no idea, quite frankly. And I was leaping before it was ready. There were a couple of times in the book I actually mentioned that how I agreed to take the next step and then 2 seconds later, I was like, what the heck did I just do that
Right.
for?
And it wasn't heck you were saying, probably.
No, that's a PG-13
Yes,
version.
yes.
And I openly talk about that, but I talk about why I went ahead and said yes before I was ready. I talked about what I learned from not being ready. And then I actually said, hey, maybe I should encourage others now. And yes, it worked out. Um, but there was also things that I wish I'd known.
Sure.
And I talk about that. I was like, why did I have to learn all of that the hard way? And it would have been great if I hadn't had to do it. So
It's kind of a theme for you, though. I think
yeah.
there was no easy way for anything that you did.
No, there was a lot of figure it out. But I do think, could I have, could I have had more impact if I had had a different foundation, or if I'd had a different sort of on ramp? And so I demystify some of that and say, this is what I've learned. This is the framework that worked. And I just speak into some of that.
That's great. Let's talk about your industry a little bit and the leadership within it, because I find fascinating, if anyone listens or watches the Changemakers podcast, your guests fall into two camps. One, the Katie Goar camp. They lived in affordable housing projects, what have you, and it inspired them to make it a living out of it. The others are, I fell into this, which is always funny. Like, how would you fall into something like this? And every time someone shares one of these stories on your podcast, you're like, I just don't understand how someone falls into this. So tell me about your industry and how there is this mixture of people that obviously it's kind of like, again, hardwired into their DNA, to people that kind of just fall into. So tell me a little bit about the leaders in your industry and sort of the makeup of it.
First of all, I love this industry. So I'm going to get all starry eyed here talking about it. But you're right. You have people who are a temp, and all of a sudden they're at a housing agency. And then years later, they progress and they're executive directors. Yeah. And they bring a unique story and a flavor to that, because they're like, I just fell into it, but then they became attached to the mission, or they became attached to what the community was needing, and they wanted to solve that. Thus the change makers kind of and
moniker. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Or you have people who are saying, I actually did grow up in the projects. I'm familiar with this property. I know what was great about it, and I know what needs to be changed in this too. And so there are some really unique voices here. But what I like about this industry is that you don't have to have said, I have, run 10 different housing authorities, and that makes me a professional. You can have somebody who is the temp, who became the housing specialist, who became the manager, and who kept moving forward. And they bring just as much expertise as the person who was the absolute, highest degree. They've been there 10 places and done that. And that component, they're all sitting at the same table doing the same results.
That's great. And the other part, if anyone listens to or watches your podcast and sees actually your industry itself, is women. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of female leaders in this industry. Well, first of all, why do you think that is? And tell me about how the fact that really goes unchecked, because you always talk about how, they the stats for, women in Fortune 500 companies and CEO roles, it's like minuscule. But if you look at the housing industry, it's a lot of women. And obviously it's working out. It's great. But tell me, why do you think it is? And explain to me the idea of why there's so much women leadership here.
That's a great question. I don't even know that it's been studied, to be honest with you. I'd love to know if there was a percentage of study and why that is. So I'm just going to spitball here. Sure. I do purposely bring a lot of women's voices to the podcast. And I do believe that there is a great balance of analysis with heart, with mission, and organization, and we work in the compliance field a lot. So I believe the skill set is very, very aligned with both masculine and feminine energy. It's not too one-sided.
Sure.
Even at Quadel, we have over 80% within our company that are women. Wow. Or minorities, and that is definitely not the national statistic. But we've been very purposeful in who we hire and how we hire. And it just aligns with that compliance mind, but you have to have the compliance with compassion. So we're not just rule checkers and auditors, and we're doing a checklist, but we're also not just social workers focusing on just the people. And so to have that equal parts, I believe is maybe why women are drawn to this. I'm not 100% sure,
Yeah.
but great question.
It's funny talking about like how we fix the problem, right? And these podcasts always include some sort of like solutions that many of these executive directors are doing, even builders, people in the finance industry. And one of the themes that you always talk about is like you can't throw money at the problem.
Yeah.
Like money is not we're not gonna outspend our way out of this. And in the book, you use the line strategic generosity. So tell me about this idea of fixing housing. And again, we're not going to solve for affordable housing and the crisis in America, but like you've stated clearly that it's not just about throwing money; it's being strategic with generosity. So tell me about that sort of ideology.
So, strategic generosity can both be for the individual and the way we approach a problem. So, I'll talk about the way we approach the problem because I have seen people who are running nonprofits create entire apartments just for foster kids who were coming out of the system who needed an apartment, but they needed to be affordable. And so, entire nonprofits have said, we're going to step up and solve that. You have entire faith communities who have said, I want to step into the space and provide transitional housing. They're not just throwing money at a problem. They're saying, I'm a voice. I have a solution. I'm going to build the property and I'm going to serve that need. And I think that's the piece of strategic generosity. Nobody came out and said, here's a $50 million grant you must do. Of course, they would have loved it and they might have applied for it.
Sure.
But they, for whatever decision criteria, said, here's a problem that we're no longer going to accept in our community and we're going to solve this. And it's not just the onesie twosies. I mean, this is a national thing that I've seen. Developers even step into this space. So you've got a great blend of multiple people, private industry, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, and government who are all trying to come together to solve pieces of that. And that strategic generosity, a community can make it easier for that to happen. And on the podcast, we talk a lot about this, like, look at your zoning rules, look at your, capital stack on how you want to finance things, look at, some types of planning that you're doing. Like there are ways that you as a community can say, yeah, we actually do want to solve this problem. Now, on the individual side of strategic generosity, when it actually talks about you and me and things like this, I believe your origin story or your superpowers aren't just to sit on the bookshelf. I actually think that they need to be picked up. They need to be understood by you and then a transference to other people. And I'm encouraging people to use some of what they've gone through in life to actually say, let's be strategic and talk about this in a way that helps other people instead of just keeping that necklace of shame on.
Oh, that's great. Now let's talk about some of these solutions in terms of like federal to local, because it seems like if you listen and watch the stuff you do, it seems like most of the work is being done at the local level, like super local, like local level to like back, like we're not even talking about cities and municipalities. We're talking about like a corner of a street somewhere kind of thing. Tell me about this divide in terms of like what the federal government could do, what local governments do, local nonprofits. Is this one of the things about homelessness and affordable housing? Is this where it's almost like it's a bigger, or it's more manageable if it's locally handled as opposed to federally handled? Tell me what your thoughts are in terms of like how we're getting to there. They are fixing, again, there is no magic bullet for this, but like where do you think the best work is being done when it comes to the affordability issue, the homelessness issue, and all of these kind of things we're talking about?
Often the local communities have the power to change because they know what's happening and they know what's needed. And so they can move faster. They can change their localized rules. They can set priorities and they could just get things done in their community. And so that's like really where I think some of the action happens. But yet who has the money? The federal government. And so I think that's the tension here is that where is the purse? Where is the policy? And then where is the planning happening? And so that's the hard continuum that people are trying to navigate, because if the local community is like, great idea, we can make it happen, how do you get the money? And then the cycle to get the money out of the federal government through the grants and some of the HUD programs They're talking now you've just layered complexity. Now you've just layered a long time frame. Now it takes so much, many more rules and hoops to just turn dirt
Yeah.
and to build stuff or rehab stuff or preserve stuff. And so that is that tension, is that the local, nonprofits, the local communities, they can get it done. They just don't always have the resources to do it. And yet there are certain cities that are still making it happen despite that.
Wow. And speaking of the local level, we cannot talk about housing in America without talking about NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard, which is part of the problem. The fact that, sure, some of these local communities might have a solution for it, but then the people within that community don't want to be part of the solution. What's being done to combat that? Well, first of all, I guess we should assume that people understand the NIMBYism, but let's get into like how it starts, like NIMBY, why it starts, and then how we could combat it.
So let's say that you bought your property and you went in and you bought it because it had this great aura and this great view, and then now there's a proposed plan to build a property, and they're gonna have a parking lot, and maybe there's not even an obstructed view, but all of a sudden you as a home buyer, you're like, I bought it here because I like it here. Now there's going to be traffic and noise and construction and all of the things that you think are a problem, but yet it's in a community of choice because you wanted it there. And now then all of a sudden you find out, wait, there's 100 units and 25 of them are affordable. And all of a sudden you vilify who is going to be in those 25 units. And there becomes this tension of, you're not building it here. And yet you chose that community because of amenities, schools,
Weather,
access to resources. But yet you're now making a value proposition that says, but I deserve to be here. Those 25 people don't. And then you're like, well, who are those 25 people? But you fail to realize those 25 people, that could be the teacher of your kids. Like they actually qualify for that affordable housing unit. And so this is this whole idea of to say, why is that property now deemed not acceptable by you? And why are those 25 people, why do they not have the choice to have the same type of community? And so then obviously you see the tension, and people hide behind zoning rules and parking lot specs and noise ordinances.
infrastructure,
And,
yeah.
there's a whole bunch of things you
Yeah.
can blame and hide behind when you don't want something like that in your neighborhood. But I actually want to reverse that and say, I was homeless. Then I moved into a rental because a lady said yes to allowing our family to come into that rental unit. All right. So that moment changed the trajectory of our entire lives. Imagine then, in this example that I said of the 25 units, you're saying no to a person like me who needed housing stability. And so what are you forcing their lives to become when you don't allow those 25 units to be built? And it's just like when you say about the person who needs housing, like, so every time you say no, you're also pretty much saying yes to homelessness. And so there's this piece of us that we have to come to terms to say people need affordable housing. And had I not had that chance, I don't even know where we would be and what we would be doing right now. And we as a society we cannot accept just doing the blanket no because you think that there's going to be a noise problem or a parking lot problem and hiding behind crime statistics. And actually, when you look at the analysis, don't even pan out.
Wow. It is kind of sad too, because if you think about the effects that it has probably in businesses, right? Because you hear about this in all major cities where you'll ask an employer like, hey, can you find people? Like, I can't find anybody. I can't find anybody to work here. And most of the reason is because the employees that would possibly work there can't afford to live in a city. So not only are you shielding yourself from these atrocities of having these people live here, but you're also hurting local businesses because you can't have people employ them because no one's going to drive an hour to go be a server or an hour to be working at a store because they can't afford to live there. So it does have a trickle down effect of again, you're not only affecting those 25 people, but it has that sort of butterfly effect to the rest of the community as well. Something people don't really discuss ever.
One of the podcast guests actually was in a partnership with the development for a hospital. And they said, we have so much turnover of our nurses because exactly that same thing. They can't drive in, they get tired of these long commutes. You're turning over all of this staff for a crucial component of the workforce. And so they said, we're just going to build housing, affordable housing for our nurses because they couldn't afford to live in that city and they were driving in on long commutes. And so then that caused a ripple of staffing problems. And it's exactly what you just said. The role of affordable housing can add to the economic policy, it can add to the workforce, it can add to stability. It's more than just this help a person and make it feel good.
Right.
It's like there's a ripple through the entire community if you can bring affordable housing to the table.
And it takes the word yes, and you talk about a yes plan in your book, and I love that because I feel like there was like a cottage industry a few years ago of like the power of no and take back your life by saying no, and I feel like that's sort of like trickle into people where they're like it's no before yes, and this idea of like before you can even consider something you're saying no to, and almost very much like NIMBYism.
Yeah.
Before you think about all of these things, the benefits of building affordable housing, you're immediately saying no. But so tell me about this idea of a yes plan.
I love a yes plan because then it reframes your mind to say, how can I make this happen? And then you're like, okay, I need a plan A, I need a plan B, I need a plan C. But ultimately, it feeds into a yes plan. And you can actually, I go through this and I put a framework because I recognized a pattern in my life. Again, it was like, okay, get through school. Okay, get through here. Okay, find a job. And there was a yes plan that I had to devise in order to make it happen. And there's so much applicability to being able to write your own yes plan.
That's great. And so let's give a little plug to your day job at Quadel because you connect your personal history with Quadel's mission. You do a lot of like projects within Quadel that are sort of inspired by where you came from. So let's give a little plug to Quadel for folks not familiar, but also some of the programs that you've initiated there because of the history that we've been discussing.
So Quadel, we're a compliance outsource management company for affordable housing. And it has been a pleasure to lead Quadel. I've been there for about 19 years. And one of the first things that I, realized was we are about we are about affordable housing, but we didn't have a down payment assistance homeownership program. And I was like, wait, we're the ones that are like talking about housing stability, but we really didn't have a major tool. And so I created a first-time home buyers down payment assistance grant for our employees. And we give about $5,000 income eligible employees to be able to help them buy their first home. And that was one of the things that I said when I became a home buyer. I thought this really is a chance for me to be able to step up and have not just the stability, but to start building wealth. And so that was one of the things I did. Another thing is I looked at how we answer the phone for our clients and our participants. And I said, we're not just going to be a robo call center that just, goes through the phone tree. So I really created some training programs that say, let's hit the compliance, but let's also make sure we're paying attention to the compassion piece as well.
That's great. And so as your role as a leader there, you and actually the subtitle of the book is Go from Wannabe Leader to the Leader of Others. What do you think separates a wannabe leader from a leader? Because not every leader needs to have the Katie Goar origin story. Not everyone has to have a rags to riches.
Yeah.
Some people can have a normal life and still be a great leader. So tell me what separates the wannabe leader from the leader, or if you are a wannabe leader, how do you become a true leader?
So it was interesting because I went through a bunch of titles trying to sort this out. Like I had this whole wall of like, about this, about this, about this. And the wannabe leader that others want to be piece came to me because I was thinking, what is it that you want to be when you grow up? That's the question we all know. And there's a few people who can say, I want to be an astronaut. I want to be this. But a lot of people are like, I have no idea. And then you just through a series of steps, you get to maybe where you want to be, but maybe not. A lot of people I know, and I've seen this at Quadel, who are like, I never thought I could be a trainer. I never thought I could be a manager. And they are going through and they need a little nudge. And so, yet it's not real tidy on how you get there. And so I started to speak to this is how you actually can create your yes plan, form your hype squad, and I actually start going through a little bit of a roadmap to say this is how you can get from where you are to where others want to be like you. And I just write it out and I'm like, this is what worked for me. Feel free to use the same for you.
You talk about hype squads in the book, and you mentioned it there. What is a hype squad? I mean, I think we know hype man from the old school hip hop days, but tell me about the idea of having a hype squad and how important that is. Part of your plan you're talking about.
So a lot of people say don't surround yourself with people who are yes people, and that is true when it comes to decision parenting, like parrots, like
Yeah.
the Pollyanna cracker parrots, right? Like that's not what you want when you're making crucial decisions. Everybody who just says yes.
Mhm.
I'm talking about something different. That's a hype squad of somebody who's going to support you, who's going to challenge you, who's going to nudge you, part cheerleader, part coach, part mom who says, just get it done. And I really focus on you've got to find a group of people like that. Because of my backstory, it forced me to be overly self sufficient and not create that. Because I was like, you just better do it yourself and figure it out. So I actually went to the extreme and that worked until it didn't work. And then it all started falling apart. And I mentioned this because I realized you really do have to have a hype squad when it comes to certain crossroads in your life to be able to form your own Lent council, if you will, that says, let's talk through the complexity here of what I'm going through or the decision at hand. And I really encourage people to create your own hype squad and to help elevate you and your voice and what you need to do.
That's great. On a random note, I want to talk about rodeos. Because anyone watches your podcast on YouTube, you have like a little like piece of art that says first rodeo, second rodeo, third rodeo. Tell me about this idea about rodeos, because I love that line, not my first rodeo kind of thing. But tell me about how that plays a role in you, and so it's so important to you that you actually have like a sign of it in your house. But tell me about this idea of rodeos.
Well, obviously, your first rodeo, you're like, what the heck? I don't know what I'm doing here. All very fair.
Yeah.
Because it establishes some of that grit, some of that tenacity, some of that figure it out. Very, very fair. But then I saw through my career change and my life change, I was like, okay, the second rodeo was like, all right. Yeah, I'm sort of learning the ropes. I've learned some lessons the hard way and I'm starting to navigate this. But then by the time you get to your third rodeo, you're like, oh, this ain't no thing, right? And you develop a different level of audacity. And that's what I wanted to speak to is say, wait, that didn't have to be saved for the third rodeo though.
Mm.
So like I went through that progression, but technically that didn't have to beat it. What if I'd been able to start with that? What if my foundation had been different? And so I start openly disseminating some of that I learned, but I wish I'd learned it earlier in life, or maybe not as traumatically or from some of the bundles and things that didn't work out. So I speak to some of that.
That's great. And so if people finish this book, is there an act of an audacity that you'd like them to take as sort of like, is there a small step in audacity? Are there baby steps in audacity? What do you hope people like in terms of like taking action, whether in their life at home or in a business? What's the step someone can take to reach that sort of like level of audacity?
Start with a win journal.
Mm.
We are negative Nancy's by nature. We want to go to catastrophize something immediately. We all have fears. And those voices are really, really loud, no matter what your origin story is. Even if, you grew up in a place where all the mailboxes matched, you still have a piece and a voice that you have to overcome. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. But what I found is a win journal, a daily win journal. A lot of people talk about it, gratitude journal,
Sure.
whatever you want to talk about it. I'm just saying, start it. 3 things every single day, start a win journal. What worked for me? What gave me joy? What actually worked out that I didn't think was going to work out? And start capturing that. Because what happens is your mind's like, oh, yeah, that was great. And you get that little bit of perk up. You get that little adrenaline pop, right? But then, like a couple of weeks later, then it dips back down and you're like, oh, it's all bad again. And the voices get loud. But a win journal says, I'm going to flip back and read this because look what I overcame. Look what I learned. Look at the muscles that I developed through that repetition of learning that. And that is the piece that voice gets silent, and it should be as equally loud as those voices that are telling you, what if it doesn't turn out? Because you need to know, "Oh, look at how it did turn out." And speaking from somebody who lived in a tent, like I'm like, okay, like there's something to this to say, well, what if it does get better? And so that one piece that I say is start your win journal.
That's great. And it's so funny because there's this line in the book. It's slightly contradictory, but you say that leadership is an act of rebellion. And when people think about leadership, they don't really, unless you're leading a rebellion, unless you're in Star Wars, but like most people don't see leadership as rebellion. Tell me about that and why that mindset is sort of like when it comes to going through the rodeos and being audacious, like why do you think that's important to capture that sort of mindset of being rebellious when it comes to leadership?
Leadership is not for somebody who's just going to sit in a pretty corner office or have the fancy degree with all the acronyms behind it. It's not a pedigree, whether you are born with leadership or you don't have leadership. So I actually say, okay, leadership is an act of rebellion, and this doesn't have to be reserved for just the person in the corner office, just the person who's 5 generations deep in a particular business line or with the fancy degree. And I go through and say, you can actually develop the skill set for leadership to decide, yeah, I'm getting to the corner office, or yes, I want to do this. Or maybe I'm an introvert and I'm not an extrovert, so I don't think I could be a leader. And I go through and say, leadership is an act of rebellion that you can choose to be a part of. And you can actually accelerate that. And here's why. And I have you break through, what is your origin story? What have you learned? What have you overcome? Where do you have resilience? And I'm like, let's go through this conversation. At the end of every single chapter, I go through something called a tough love moment. Maybe it's because I'm a mom and I have 5 kids. I'm not really sure, because there's a lot of tough love mom attributes that you have to have. And I break apart ways by which you can develop a skill set that maybe you just haven't known how to master.
Wow, that's great. And speaking of your mother, you have a lot of children. I often joke with you that I lose count of how many kids you have. How does motherhood, like, sort of inform your leadership from your 9 to 5? Because I've worked with folks who, like, before they had children were like utter psychopaths, and then they have children and all of a sudden they're like completely different people at work. Did that change you at all, being a mother, in terms of like maybe being more understanding to mistakes or what have you? But like, did your motherhood change some of your leadership style along the way?
Absolutely. You're not going to go through all of that. I think teenagers love them, but you learn so much about how to manage people after you've had teenagers.
Right. Yeah.
But you also really realize that every single one of my kids is so different. Same parents, right? And I'm like, how do they all turn out so different? Well, it's the same thing when you're in management. Like the management tools, what you can say or the guidance or the clarity changes for every single person. How things are interpreted, you may have to ebb and flow differently depending on which team. So there's a whole skill set that you can develop from being a parent, and it absolutely did change. The pieces that you learn about how a person can develop when you believe in them.
Hmm.
Who needs some encouragement? Who needs some tough, loud, big voices? Who needs a soft approach? Who needs more of a booming voice approach, or whatever those like pieces are? It causes you to understand more about what you say, how you function, and how you interact with people. So there's a situational awareness and a self-awareness that you develop from being a mother.
No, that's great. So as we wind things down, if someone's watching this and they're in affordable housing and they've they can relate to a lot of the problems we've discussed today, whether it's funding, NIMBYism, local issues, federal issues, and they feel like, I can't fix this. There's nothing I could do here. Like there's a level of frustration where they're like, I don't know if I could keep doing this. I don't know if I could be Katie Goar and do this for 25, 30 years. What do you say to that person who's sort of like in that fork in the road where they're like, I don't know if this is the path for me? What do you say to them?
You don't have to fix it all. Find one particular niche that you want to do, and then just get completely laser focused. Just absolutely tackle that to the ground. Find out what that is, though. Find your hype squad and let the hype squad say to you, you talk about single mothers a lot. Maybe you should actually zero in on helping single mothers. And then how would that look? What does that mean? And really pull that thread really, really hard, because they're seeing something in you that you have friction, that you have passion, that how can it be channeled? One of the podcasts I have it was Traeger Strasberg with Humble Design. And she actually had a coworker who was homeless, but who was moving into an apartment and didn't have any furnishings. And she was like, what's happening? Well, when you're homeless, you don't have necessarily a storage shed full of desks
Couches,
and beds and all of the things. And so her whole focus was, I'm going to help this person move in and furnish her apartment. And when she made the call, it's like, who has this? Who has that? Furniture just started showing up. And Traeger ended up creating a nonprofit that helps thousands of people across the nation to do this now. And so it was one person solving one problem, solving one need, and stepping into that void. And then look what it was developed into. And I think there are so many more triggers that are out there that actually can solve one person's problem with one thing, with one solution, and then let's see where it blooms.
I love that. I love to ask folks the sliding doors question, the Gwyneth Paltrow movie where she misses the subway and her life takes one direction, she catches the subway, it goes the other way. And so when I ask that to folks, there's usually like one sliding door moment. You have had thousands of sliding door moments, but the one that jumps out is that one opportunity of the person allowing you to rent that apartment for your family. Let's go to that sliding door. If that door never opened to you, where do you see yourself? What do you think your life looks like if that one moment doesn't happen to you?
Well, statistics say that there should have been a felon amongst our mates and our siblings. There should have been a teenage early pregnancy. There should have been a high school dropout. There should have been a drug addict. A lot of statistics say exactly who we should have become had we stayed in the tent, had we stayed in really, really bad housing. And we bumped around from crappy rental to crappy rental for quite a while. And statistics were not in our favor on what would have happened had we not had a chance to stabilize. And none of that happened, because the stability of housing helped set us on a course that we could be in the same school system, that we could actually start to say, maybe we can focus on where we're going to hang our backpack. We can focus on, we're at the same table now every single night. We actually can do homework. And so that moment changed how we got to the next thing, which was our education, which was how we got to the next thing, which was our jobs. And every single one of my siblings, we beat the statistics.
Wow. She's Katie Goar. The book is called Audacity. Katie, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.